Hello. I'm very, very pleased to introduce our final panel of the two-day Symposium of QUESCREN researcher members. And I will go no further than to introduce you to Licia Canton. Dr. Canton has long been a QUESCREN researcher member and she will provide more details about herself. But just to say, she's a very active community-based researcher in the field of literature. Licia?
Thanks very much, Lorraine. Well, I'm very happy to get this discussion started by introducing the people who are here. I'm very pleased that you could all come. First, I'd like to thank QUESCREN for including this roundtable in your symposium program. So far at the end of the table, Domenico Beneventi is professor of literature at Université de Sherbrooke. He is director of the Équipe de recherche en études queer au Québec and past president of the Association of Italian-Canadian Writers. Christopher DiRaddo is the author of the novels The Geography of Pluto and The Family Way. He is also the founder and host of the Violet Hour reading series and book club, and a member of the Association of Italian-Canadian Writers Executive. Liana Cusmano, they, them, yel, lu, is a poet, spoken word performer, and arts educator. They are the author of the novel Catch and Release, twice Montreal Slam champion. Liana is also fiction editor at Carte Blanche and associate editor at Accenti. And I was there when Liana was born. So, yes, and I wasn't a doctor. So I am one of two proud parents of Liana. And Steve Galluccio. Steve Galluccio's most recent play, At the Beginning of Time, was produced at Centaur this past winter. His play, Mambo Italiano, is considered one of the most successful plays in Canadian theater history. It was turned into a movie and sold in more than 50 countries. And my name is Licia Canton. I'm co-founder of Accenti magazine, a past president of the Association of Italian-Canadian Writers. I'm also the author of working paper number 8, titled Queering Italo-Québécois Literature, made possible by QUESCREN. So it's a round table, so I took the mic to introduce everyone, but it's a discussion. And Domenico is going to start us off by explaining what we mean by the term queer.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Licia, for putting it together, for QUESCREN as well. Yeah, so when I was doing the introduction to Here and Now, I had to do a bit of research on the term itself, queer. So when we think about queer, we think about the 1990s in critical theory, with Eve Sedgwick, for instance, who talks about queer studies, right? But the term goes all the way back to the 16th century and even before that, all the way to the medieval ages. And queer meant something that is crooked, something that is not straight, something that is bizarre, something that's outside of the norm, right? So that's kind of the context in which queerness comes to be reclaimed in a certain sense in the 1990s in the US especially. And it basically reaches back and looking to deconstruct any kind of normativity around sexuality, obviously, around gender as well. And in a sense, it's a way of criticizing, right, the discourses around heteronormativity, family, and so on, right? So queerness is not just the fact of being queer, the fact of having same-sex desire, et cetera, but it's also the queering of all aspects of normativity, temporality, for instance, spatiality, these kinds of things, affect. So right, a bunch of theorists later on in the year 2000, in the 2000s, were looking at questions around like, how do queer people experience time, right? It's often different, and it's not the same kind of routines that you would have as a straight person, right? Where your narrative, your life narrative is already kind of laid out for you, right? You marry your sweetheart, you have children, you buy a house, etc. For queer people, it's completely different. It's very different. Spaces as well. Spatiality is also different. Questions around home space, safe space, all of these kinds of questions are kind of raised by more recent queer theorists. And finally, affect as well, right? What kind of kinship systems do we have as queer people? What is family? Is it chosen? Is it, biological ties? It complicates things around queerness. So just to bring it back to Italian Canadian, then I would say that, we've looked at all kinds of interesting themes around Italian Canadian literature. Queerness is this kind of new thing. I think Liana was talking about how we're just doing a lot on queer Italian Canadian recently. It's because it's a whole new corpus, right? Thanks to the book and other activities and so on. And it kind of questions the whole narrative of the immigrant community around family, around history, around memory, the figure of the nonna, which comes back over and over again, right? So how do queer people fit into the Italian Canadian family? How are they ostracized? How are they silenced? So there's a whole bunch of really interesting questions around forms of affiliation, forms of kinship, queering of food that comes up as well a lot, right? So food as kind of celebration of family. What happens if your family has a queer member? What happens if you are queer within an Italian household? How do you see these kinds of rituals around food, around family, etc.? So I think I'll stop there.
So we're just going to ask Steve and Liana and Chris to say something about their latest works or what they're working on right now. Do you want to go first? Sure.
My latest play was at the Centaur in was it January or February? It was February of this year, and it was called At the Beginning of Time. And basically, it was the story of the journey that I took with my husband, my first husband, who had Alzheimer's and died in 2020. But it was also the reunion of three gay Italian men all in their 60s talking about their past, again, the family, the food, and also about the present, the changing dating scene, the genders, the things that a lot of us old Italians are kind of like, what the fuck is that about? We don't really understand it. We get it. We accept it. But so there was a lot of, questioning about that. And so that was it. And now basically we're trying to get it done in French, and I'm still writing. I'm on my second play since that play, and that's about it.
I saw Steve's play twice and cried. It was beautiful. It was wonderful. It was wonderful. I think it makes the most sense for me to start with a poem, I think, because that pretty well encapsulates the themes that I've been working on, the things that I've been thinking about. This poem, how many people have seen My Brilliant Friend? Chris, a few people. My Brilliant Friend is an adaptation of Elena Ferrante's worldwide best-selling novel, published originally in Italian. And Elena Ferrante has a lot of interesting things to say about writing based on your personal experience, and how that does not in any way entitle the public to ask any more of you. There has been a lot of discourse, interesting discussions in Italy and abroad about how Elena Ferrante writes under an assumed name about things that ostensibly happened, but that she will neither confirm or deny. And nobody really has any idea who she is. And a lot of scholars and journalists insist on saying that Elena Ferrante owes the people who have read her books and watched this television series, that she owes them an explanation and owes them availability in a more public sense, because she's already written so much about her life, and why won't she take any interviews or answer any questions, which she has totally resisted, and which I personally as an artist think is totally within her rights, and definitely something that we should all consider, I think, as artists, because so many of us here write based on personal experience, and after a show or after a spoken word performance or after people have read our books or our poems, people feel entitled to know. It doesn't mean that they can't ask questions in a respectful and, interested manner, but I think that especially for those of us who write about such deeply personal things, it's within our right to say, well, I don't really want to talk about that. And I'm not really interested in telling you exactly who this character is based on, or exactly whether this experience really, really happened, because that's not the point, whether it's a play or fiction or a poem. The point is really the story. And there are different kinds of realities that are rendered in different ways in different mediums. So now I'll do the poem. This poem is called Ma ti fidanzeresti con me. We are watching L'Amica Geniale, my brilliant friend, because I am afraid that my Italian will soon become a ghost inside my mouth, shrink to simple salutations, bookending emails, be relegated to days of the week dancing at the back of my throat. After every episode following season 1, episode 4, where we heard it first, I ask, ma ti fidanzeresti con me? The subtitles read, do you want to go steady with me? There is no but at the beginning of the translation, no filler word hiding behind a comma like a single tortellino. The verbs fidanzeresti, fidanzarsi are rooted in the gendered words for fiancé. The act of becoming engaged is posited as a question, as a conditional. Even the verb tense is lost in translation. The series takes place at a time when dating wasn't anything so much as the very brief interlude before marriage, when Fellini and De Sica were at work, when some of my grandparents still lived where they had been born. We watched the series on the big screen. I refuse to put Parmigiano on our popcorn. As time goes on, still other words evoke a time and place that I thought I had forgotten, a childhood spent on balconies and in backyards and at kitchen tables. Phrases like dammi la manina, vai a prendere un cerotto, andiamo a fare il bagno. As we watch an Italy constructed for the screen, for storytelling, for entertainment, a carousel of memories comes to life inside my head, of holding Nonna's hand as we cross the street, of fetching Band-Aids for Papa from the bathroom cabinet, of going to the beach and playing in the water. I'm afraid that the only leftovers of my childhood will be a language that melts in my mouth before I can speak. After every episode, I ask her, ma ti fidanzeresti con me? Because asking in this language and not another feels like reaching into a future where all the words I need are on hand and not on the tip of my tongue. Ma ti fidanzeresti con me? She never recognizes the words, only the tone, only the way I look at her when I say it. Ma ti fidanzeresti con me? She never really understands the first time and I have to repeat it. And so every time I ask her is like the first time, and every time she says yes is like the first time. We live in a daydream of firsts, a real-life mini-series of always asking to be together and always saying yes. Ma ti fidanzeresti con me? As if we don't hold hands when we cross the street, as if I don't keep her favorite brand of Band-Aid in my bathroom cabinet, as if we've never been to the beach and played in the water or lain together in the sun. On the day she learns the words posso avere un bacio and says them to me, I realize that this is just another way of saying I love you, which we have said more times and in more ways than I could ever hope to count, on all the fingers of all the hands of all the people I knew back when I was 4, on the balcone and in the giardino and the tavola. Ti voglio bene grande così. I love you this much. This love is bigger and wider than the largest measurement I could hope to express by stretching out my arms back when I was 5. Ma ti fidanzeresti con me? I ask as if I don't know the answer because I never get tired of hearing it. I never get tired of hearing her say yes as if it were the first time. I never get tired of hearing words in our mouths that mean home.
Yeah, I love that poem. Liana and I did an event earlier this year and you read it. And I love also how you include Italian in it. I'm very jealous that you speak it. And I'm really wish my parents had forced me to learn Italian at a very young age. I'm 646 days on Duolingo now. So, you know, I know how to say that the snake is in the boot, but, you know, it's a classic phrase. Yeah, so I am the author of 2 books. The Geography of Pluto was my first book. It came out in 2014. It took me 14 years to write, which is a very long time. I didn't know what I was doing. I'd like to think that I do now. The book is about the relationships that gay men have with their moms. I think a lot of us gay folks we feel very kind of close to our mothers, and I know that I did, and I wanted to write a story that basically kind of compares kind of like a gay man's first love. So first loves being mom, but also kind of the first relationship that you're in. So the book kind of compares the two, set in Montreal one cold winter. And then the second one, which took me 7 years to write, so half the time. So hopefully the next one will only take 3.5. The Family Way is a story of how we kind of create how we create family as queer folk. In my personal life, I am a sperm donor. 2 very close friends. We have 2 children together. They're their children, but I help bring them into the world. And I wanted to write a fictionalized retelling of that experience. You know, I like what you said. You know, we don't have to kind of know exactly what happened, or but all to kind of say is that the spirit of both of these books are very autobiographical. And yeah, I think I'm very much interested in family, notions of family, kind of our relationships as queer people to the people in our families. It's really interesting to me to be on this panel, and, Dominic, like you were saying, all of a sudden there's a lot more kind of like corpus for us to kind of talk about identity as queer Italian people. And it isn't something that I had honestly given much thought of until the last couple of years or so. I remember meeting you, Dominic, at the airport in Montreal. We've known each other for years, but I was off to Berlin on holiday with my boyfriend, and Dominic was going to Rome to a conference, and we ran into each other and had a drink, and we're talking like, well, what are you going to Rome to do? And he's like, well, I'm actually delivering a paper on your book. And I remember like thinking, what do you mean? Like, and it was just such a weird thing to me, because I was just like, Dominic, who studies queer Italian literature, found something interesting in my book that I thought that like wasn't relevant, or I kind of maybe hid the Italianness of my character a little bit in that. And then I don't know. I think, and then a couple years ago, Licia made the documentary "Creative Spaces" that all of us are in, and it really started to get me thinking about things in ways that I hadn't. And I would have been hard pressed to be able to kind of name someone other than Steve, who'd been writing about the kind of queer Italian Canadian experience. Maybe they were out there, but I for sure didn't know. And so I've been very excited about the last couple of years, because it feels it's inspired me greatly. And goodness knows that we're seeing more events, we're seeing more projects, we're also angering people, which is also quite interesting. Maybe we'll get to that a little bit later. But so thank you for allowing us to kind of come and chat. I feel there's so much that we can kind of talk about, but I'll leave it there for me at the moment. Okay, well, maybe then I'm kind of curious to ask you, Dominic, too, because when I said, you found something in my first book that you felt like, okay, there's something being said here that I don't really see that often. What was your, I don't know, I don't want to put you on the spot, but what was your sense of kind of stories being told by queer Italians at that time? I guess, was there a lot that you were seeing kind of pre 5 years ago, or?
Not really. I mean, that's the thing. Not really. I mean, that's the thing, right? That with this book and other projects and so on, stuff comes to the surface. I'm working on a paper on Frank Canino, who's getting on in years and so on. And he wrote a play about this woman called the Angelina Project. And in that play, he talks about an actual historical event of this woman who basically brutally murders her abusive husband, right? And as I'm reading this play, I'm thinking, okay, where's the queer content here? And there is queer content here. It's the queering of history. There's one character that is obviously a lesbian in that play, right? So it's a question of figuring out how do you go back in history and pull out all of this material? How do you go back in history and look at what has had to be hidden in the past, kind of thing, right? So it's, in a sense, it's kind of an archaeological dig, if you will, especially when it comes to writing about communities where these kinds of things are very taboo, right? And so it's not just a question of looking at queer characters, it's a question of looking at, other things like narrative techniques that are queer, or representations of time and space that are queer, odd, strange, turns of phrase, translation. You were talking about translation, right? How do you translate things? I'm presenting in Toronto on several writers in this book. And in that, there's this whole question around translation, right? Around, how do you translate the non-binary body from English to Italian, or from Italian back to English, right? So it's all of these kinds of questions that really challenge what it means to be Italian Canadian. You were talking about how you were getting negative feedback by certain, more conservative elements of Italian Canadian community. But these are things that have to be said. These are things that have to be done. If we go back to the 1980s, 1990s in Italian Canadian, the academia, if you will, right? Writing by women suddenly was this thing. It's like, oh my God, women writing, Italian Canadian women writing, right? And it's challenging, right? This idea of very patriarchal kind of society. And this, I think, is the same kind of idea of challenging a very heteronormative, very patriarchal, very conservative, religious even sometimes, very traditionalist kind of thing, where people within your own family are silenced completely, right? The big Italian wedding. Well, I mean, there's like 400 people there. 10% of those people are queer, right? So like they have a voice, they have a place, and they have stories that need to be told. So I think that that's part of the work that is being done right now in this moment.
Yeah, Dominic has referred to this book, Here and Now. The Queer and Italian Canadian Project, we started that just before the pandemic. In January of 2020, I started interviewing, well, the three people here for the Creative Spaces Queer and Italian Canadian documentary, which was supposed to be, it ended up being Montreal based because of the pandemic. Because it was supposed to be a series of interviews with writers from across Canada. And at the time, we had identified about 10 across Canada. And, you know, the pandemic was not as short as we had expected. So we did this book, Here and Now, and we have 35 writers who are members of the Italian community and members of the LGBTQ+ community in this book. Some who are not in this book, so there are more. But I'm working on a second volume, and I've identified 20 new writers, including about 5 from Montreal. And, you know, it's a question too of identifying them. There may be some who have dropped their Italian name. I'm thinking of Amber Dawn in Vancouver. I had heard her read on the CBC, but I had no clue she was of Italian heritage, right? Yeah, so the Queer and Italian Canadian Project has a website, queeritaliancanadian.com, where we are housing the bios of everyone who's involved in the project. Excuse me. Steve.
Well, I would say that my biggest fans are, my biggest fans and followers are in the Italian community. The fantastic thing about it is that when I wrote Mambo, when Mambo came onto the scene, I came in like a tsunami, and I hadn't expected to do that, but it was just like, oh my God, this guy's Italian, he's gay, and he's writing about it. And so it excited a lot of people, not only within the Italian community, but within other ethnic communities. 20 years later, there are, you know, kids who have grown up watching the movie, and I get DMs, and I get them coming up to me saying, you helped me come out. And it was like, that's great, because, you know, I wrote the play without having come out myself. So that was like a really fantastic thing that I helped other people come out. Now this play was totally different because this is me 20 years later. And again, the Italian community is there. I mean, I see older people coming to see my play, and, you know, they're only speaking Italian, and they have a very limited, I think, understanding of English or French. And they're there and they're enjoying it. And especially this last one, I think it was heavy. And but I think that I write not only I don't only write about being gay, I write about being Italian and about having very human experiences. The first one was about this, you know, guy coming out to his parents. This one was about me losing my husband and what it's like to grow old, and everybody grows old. It's not like it's a little bit different in the queer community, obviously, you know, having to deal with possibly going to a CHSLD and possibly going back into the closet because there are no gay CHSLDs, which was a little bit the experience with my husband. But I mean, they're very universal themes. So there's a journalist who told me once, he was a very activist journalist within the gay community, and he called me up and he said, and we were kind of friends, and as you know, as friendly as you can get with a person from the media, and when you're an artist, and he said to me, he said, you know what, I'm really pissed off with you. I said, why? He said, because I've been writing about the gay experience for so long, and gay rights and all this, and he goes, you come up with this play, which is basically a straight play, but it's a gay play, and I think you've done more for the for the gay community than I have. And I said, well, that's Matthews, because I'm not like fucking shouting off the rooftop, you know, like you do, you know. It's like, I'm not like, and I did, you know, back in the day, I still am, I think I still consider myself an activist, but back in the day I was in the protests, and there was, you know, the sex garage protests and all that. You know, you guys are too young to remember that, but we were there because we were being, you know, targeted as queer people. But all this to say that the Italian community, I think, embraced me. Some of them, and some are really pissed off, but I mean, it's not only Italians. I piss off everybody for some reason. I piss off gays too. So, I mean, it's just not Italians. But I think it's because it's, you know, I write about my life and it's not that exciting. I mean, it's just like, it's not like, hey, I'm gay, I'm queer, I'm here, you know, whatever. It's just like me and I happen to be gay and this is what I'm going through right now and everybody's gone through it. So I guess that's it. Nothing to see here.
I like what you say, Stephen. Sometimes I wish I could piss people off with my writing. I have this like piece of paper that I keep over my desk that a teacher at Concordia actually told me it was, and it said, if a writer's not offending his friends, family, and country, he's not doing his job. And I just kind of was like, I just need to remind myself that anytime that I feel like, oh, maybe I need to kind of dial this back a little bit. My mom might not like this one, you know, but it's like, no, you know, like, let's just, you know, be authentic, tell the story and, you know, and it'll resonate. And that's what you want. You want an emotional reaction from the people who like engage with your work, I think.
Well, you know, when I do something and I don't get hate email, I feel that I haven't done my job. Do you know what I'm saying? I mean, this last one was pretty inoffensive and we got this email just like I was responsible for all the shootings within the trans community. And I don't know, because my play had nothing to do with the trans community. I think it just mentioned transgender ones. And somehow this person felt that I was responsible for the shootings. And I'm like, wow. But I mean, I wasn't happy about it. But the thing is that, and this is the only email I know about because I know Centaur got more. But if you don't piss people off, just like if you don't make people happy, or if you don't, you know, it's the spectrum. It's like making people really happy, making people really love you, making people really hate you. There's nothing really in between. If you're in between, if there's that gray area, you might as well just become a plumber or something. You know? Just as nothing against plumbers. I mean, there you go. Now the plumbers are gonna, you know.
So Licia, I'm kind of curious, like you meant like you got some hate mail recently.
Oh, yes,
So I'm kind of curious, like, you know, I want to just say thank you because like so much of what we're doing is because you've started this conversation. You know, it's such a great, it's a form of allyship, right? But it's really interesting to me that like all of a sudden you're getting the hate mail
Yes.
and something that I think like a lot of us might have used to getting some kind of homophobic response to things we do. Like, what was your response to that? I'm curious.
So thank you, QUESCREN, for including this panel, which I publicized, you know, on social media. I also sent a press release to the Italian papers of Montreal, and I have never gotten such a response in a negative way. So I've been working on this project for 3 years, and if they're not liking what I'm doing, nobody has told me. I've only seen support. And then a couple of weeks ago, I shared this message. You know, I had to speak to a therapist. I was so shaken, and somebody who deals with specifically LGBTQ plus issues. Somebody who's been following my work and would have seen, you know, invitations to the launch of this book or screenings of the film, said he doesn't want to see anything with the word queer in it, and he doesn't want me using universities to promote this project. And he took the time to write this very lengthy response, and I was baffled because I thought he's about my age. I'm 60. He's educated, he's cultured, he's a leader in the community. And the only thing I said, you know, just unfriend me. This is my project, and I'm an ally. And I think possibly, and a question for later, has anything changed in 3 years, is that until now, I've been doing online events or events outside of Montreal, Toronto mostly, Italy. And so now he's seeing things in the Italian paper in Montreal, and it's in person. You can come in person. So that's maybe the difference. Or did he just decide that it's, I don't know. Maybe I'm going on too long with this project. Maybe he thought it would die. We've just gotten started. So that, sorry, I'm not going to say who he is, but he's not my friend anymore. But I also have to say, so I do go to church because I've also had people say to me, well, you know, the Italian Canadian community or the Italian-Montreal community is very religious, or the members of that board are very religious. They're not going to support your project. And I go to church. I don't believe in everything the church says, but I go. And the first, the first rule is love your neighbor, not love your neighbor unless only the neighbors who are like you, right? So on the positive, with the publicity of this event specifically, I had this elderly gentleman, 89 years old, Italian Canadian, who follows me on Facebook, who said, I'm not equipped to understand, but I am willing to listen. So that, made up for the other guy, and they were both guys. So yeah, I guess, Steve, by your definition, I'm only starting to do my job now, 3 years later, because I'm now starting to get some hate mail. Thank you. Thank you. So I'm grateful to the four of you for having, embarked on this project, but I wonder if what has changed in the last 3 years from January 2020 to May 2023, has anything changed apart from the fact that we found more people who can identify with this or who are willing to participate in the project? Has anything changed?
I wanted to make a quick comment on the hate mail, because that's a message that I've read. And I think it would be cool to mention who it is, but we won't. And it's interesting because those messages are always sort of the same. They're very long and they're very verbose and they're full of like personal, qualifiers, like I've done this and I lived through this and here's why I'm equipped to have this biased opinion, on and on and on and on. To me, the queer communities and the Italian Canadian communities have been two circles in a Venn diagram that have not met ever until the last few years. And I came up as a poet in the spoken word community, starting a few years ago. And I didn't know any Italian Canadians in the community, but we were all queer, we were all trans. The spoken word community is considered a very accessible community for a very accessible art form that anybody can do. Anybody can write something and get up on a stage, in front of an audience who will applaud you, independently of whether, you've written something that's good or not. And so the members of the spoken word community are usually queer, trans, disabled, people of color, people who are neurodivergent, who are on the spectrum. And so to step out of that community and to bring the two circles of the Venn diagram together has been a very interesting experience, because I know all these young queer people who can appreciate the differences that we all have within us, the different intersections at which we all live, and then to sort of bring that into the Italian Canadian community and to come up against some of this resistance has been jarring. And that's a mark of my age and the generation that I'm a member of, because I wasn't there when there were protests, when all of these things happened. And I'm not as well versed in queer history as I would like to be, because it's also not something that's taught in our schools. It's something that's erased, that's sort of left by the wayside. And so in the last few years, what's been very interesting is to notice all of these, especially young queer Italian Canadians who are also artists, who have always just been there, but who are now coming out of the woodwork because we went and we got them, we called them, or we wrote to them, or we emailed them. And the response from the members of that community in those two intersections has been so positive and so grateful. Like, oh, I didn't know about this. I didn't know about this book. I didn't know about the documentary. And it's great to meet these people and to notice that there are all these little differences, because we all live our queerness and our Italianness in a different way, but there's also all these points of commonality, the different names that we have for things, the different experiences that we've had, especially in St. Leonard or in RDP, huge places with huge numbers of people. But the common experience that so many of us have had, especially those of us who went to the Italian Canadian high schools, who experienced homophobia in those Italian Canadian high schools, to have all of these points of connection with all these different people in the last few years has been really interesting. That's the biggest change that I've noticed, is the growth of this community, which has been really wonderful.
Okay, what changed in the last couple of years? I remember, Licia, when you approached me with doing the documentary, I was like, I don't have anything to say. Like, well, what am I going to say? I'm like, I'm only half Italian, and I've kind of tried to keep that at bay for a very long time, because I felt like my sexuality and my cultural background could not mix. And all of a sudden I'm like, oh no, it can mix. Yeah, it can mix really well. And so for me personally, I can't really speak, I guess, like for like obviously everyone, but like for me, what's changed is it's really kind of inspired my next project. So I'm working on another book, and I'm going to be delving into a lot more kind of like Italian Canadian identity in the suburbs of Quebec in the late 80s. So that's my next project. But one of the other things though that I've really seen is that we've been doing events, right? So last summer, inspired also by like this work, I invited Steve Gaspar Borsellino, who head up the Gruppo Italiano Gay Lesbico in the 90s in Montreal. It was a huge organization that was extremely impactful, but no longer they're defunct. And then also VDG, who is a non-binary writer and photographer. So that we all had a conversation about like Queer Montreal, and over 100 people came to that event. It was held at the Instituto Culturale de Montréal, and for them also to kind of like give us the room, say yes, have your event, come, or provide the wine. We did that. It was a Fierté Montréal event, and I could kind of see people at this event that I've never seen at my other events before. So it's like, wow, we're really kind of reaching a new audience. And one of the things that we were talking about is just like, okay, well, what's next? What's the next frontier? And we talked about Casa Italia because, again, like, how do we bring, like, we're already kind of having a conversation with our friends or the people in our room. How do we bring it to like the different kind of communities? So one of the things that like I did this year was like, I went up to the Casa d'Italia and I said, hey, I'd like to do an event. Pride is the month of August in Montreal, and it's also a Talfest Montreal. Like, what can we do? And there was this project. Liana is working with a photographer, Vincenzo Petropalo. Did I get that correctly? On portraits of queer Italian Montrealers. And Vincenzo took the photos, and Liana is writing poetry to these images. And we're going to do an exposition at the Casa d'Italia this year, which is going to be part of both the Talfest Montreal and also part of Fierté Montréal. Licia's documentary is also going to be screened in the Casa d'Italia. The Instituto also want to do something. And, so they're helping me along with Dominic's group. I'm going to get it wrong. Quebec Queer Studies and Research, as well, bringing in Christopher Castellani, who is a Italian American author, queer, writing about the experience. So all of a sudden I'm really excited that like, whereas it felt like 4 years ago, or even like since like the Gruppo Italiano Gay Lesbico disbanded, there wasn't a place where you could kind of celebrate both parts of your identity. And now it just feels like there are more opportunities. So anyway, that's where I feel like things have kind of changed.
Yeah, just to follow up on what Chris is saying, it's visibility, it's things getting published, right? It's, books like that one in libraries and so on. A grad student in my program is translating your novel into French, right? So it's having the material in libraries, having the material online. People are interested in this, grad students are interested in this stuff, and they're going to write theses about it, they're going to publish articles about it and so on. And these kind of events just open up the idea of visibility, which is exactly what was missing in the actual community, where you don't talk about it, you don't say anything about it. We know that person is gay, etc. We don't say anything about it. We don't ask questions about their lives, about their day-to-day life and so on. So it's really this idea of having a corpus to work with that was not there before, I think, before Steve's work, right? I mean, it just wasn't there, right? So I think that's the thing that has changed most.
I think what has changed also is what Chris was saying with this documentary. The fact when Chris invited me to that event, and when he said that it was at the Instituto, I'm like, really, at the Instituto? They're actually letting queer inside the building, knowing that they're gay. It's like, wow. So that is, the Casa d'Italia getting involved, and that's amazing. Those are the great changes. And I think on a broader scale, when we did Mambo almost 20 years ago, it was not easy to get into a mainstream theater. We got into two mainstream theaters, at CEP in French and at Centaur in English. but especially Centaur, it was very difficult. There was a lot of pushback, but we did it. Now, when I present my plays and they're gay, there's not even a question in mainstream theaters. There's not even a question of like, they're queer, they're whatever. It's like, oh, okay, this is a new play by Steve, and there's no pushback anymore. So that is a major fucking change, because before it was like, you know, you could do those plays at the Fringe or stuff like that, but not in mainstream theaters.
Liana, did you want to say something? Okay. Well, we can start. If you have any questions, we can integrate the questions into the discussion, right? So does anyone have any questions about anything? Oh, wow. Okay. So, Patrick.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about identity, queer identity, Italian identity. We're the Quebec English speaking communities research network. Where does English speaking fit into the whole identity framework? I'm curious to hear. What's the hierarchy?
Yeah.
I don't know of any writers, queer Italian, writing in French, for instance. You know, so I mean, we're educated mostly in English, and so that's our language. And there's obviously dialects mixed in, Italian mixed in, and so on. So, I mean, my sense of belonging in Quebec is always through, even though I teach in French University, it's still English, right? So.
Yeah, I mean, I understand French. You know, I can write. I would never write a book in French, and I think, you know, my mind is definitely. It's funny because I don't speak Italian either, right? Like, so for me, it's all English. Like, you know, everything I think about is like through the prism of like my identity also as like a minority in Quebec. You know, my next project, like I said, it's going to be set in 1989 in Quebec in the suburbs, and you know, I was one of the kids who got to stay in my high school. I didn't have to kind of like change high school because of Bill 101, but I still kind of had this experience of feeling very othered in my neighborhood as well. So I think, you know, this is a really great question, because it is actually now making me think about how that could also kind of inform my next project as well, because, you know, I've been thinking about it mostly in terms of like my relationship to the Italian language and not knowing the Italian language. But yeah, like Dominic's saying, I don't necessarily know, unless like Steve, like your works was always translated into French, right? So, yeah.
I just wanted to say that I have written in French. My play Secrétariat was written in French, but I'm a little bit of an exception, because my parents, even though I was born in 1960, I was raised in Italian and in French, because I had an uncle living with us that was Italian, but like fourth generation, so we only spoke French and English. And they had the insight of sending me to before Bill 101, to a bilingual elementary school. So we did half the day in French, half the day in English. So by the time I was like, from as far back as I can remember, I was trilingual. I spoke French, English, Italian. So for me, I don't really feel part of the English community, and I don't feel part of the French community, and I don't feel part of the Italian community. I love the term allophone. It's amazing, because it's like, and I love to be othered. You know, I don't like being part of a group. I just like myself. This is who I am. But yes, I think that with my cousins, with my friends, and I started writing in English actually for one simple reason, is that my mother did not understand English. So I could write whatever the fuck I wanted, and she'd come to my shows, and they were gay and this and that, and she's like, sì, era buono, sì. She didn't understand a fucking thing. When I did Mambo at Giuseppe, now I don't know if you guys know Giuseppe, it's at Place des Arts. It's an 800-seat theater. It's one of the biggest theaters in Canada. All of a sudden, my parents are in the audience, and I was so nervous, because I knew that for the first time in their lives, they were going to understand every word. And so I remember I was backstage with one of the actresses, Véronique Leflagen. I said, Véronique, je suis tellement nerveux, j'ai le trac. Je dis, mais non, ça va bien aller, Steve, ça va bien aller. C'est le triomphe, tu vas voir. I said, Véronique, I'm not scared about the play. I'm scared that my parents are in the audience, and they're going to understand everything, and they're going to throw me out of the house tonight. But they loved it. They loved the play. But that's why I started writing in English. So my parents didn't understand. So that, again, that's just like me. Like, I don't think anybody else could, could say that. Yeah.
I think, like Dominic mentioned, it's interesting to notice that within the community that is Quebec, a lot of the Italian Canadians that we know are Anglophone. And I grew up in an Italian Canadian Anglophone suburb. And a lot of that, there are a lot of historical reasons for that. In the 50s and 60s, the Italians were not Protestants. And so the Protestant schools didn't want them. And they, weren't French speaking. And so the French speaking schools didn't want them. And there were all of these, these big linguistic and educational debates about where do we put these Italians? And the result is that, you have entire suburbs of largely English speaking communities who are descended from immigrants, where the government and different schools were like, we don't know where to put your kids. So just, figure it out. And what's interesting to me is that English for my grandparents who lived in those neighborhoods after they emigrated, so much of Italian Canadian slang is Italian and English. And there's a little bit of French as well. But words like la fenza and il garbicio, like those are, combinations of English and Italian words. And so it's very interesting to notice the particularities of certain linguistic communities and certain neighborhoods within the context of an Anglophone environment in Quebec. You have questions?
I'm not Italian, but my husband is, and I have a daughter who lives in Rome, so I have some experience with Italy. I was wondering, knowing Italian Canadians here in Montreal, what the difference is, what your experience is, how different is it for queer in Italy as it is to Italian? Because Italian Canadians often are a society, a group over 50 years that have grown up. They're not the Italians of Italy anymore, right? And if you compare them to their relatives over there, and when you said that you went over, you were presenting a paper in Italy. So I was just curious to know, and are your works, how are they received if they're translated or go to Italy? How is that? What is the difference?
Well, in my experience, growing up in Canada as a gay man, as a queer man, when I do go back to Italy, I feel it's more conservative. It's more patriarchal. It's more, the gender roles are still very, like, at least in my experience, still very, very rigid and so on. The very first queer studies conference ever in Italy happened a few years ago, right? So when we think about queer studies as a discipline, an academic discipline, which goes all the way back to the early 90s, it's kind of like catching up, and the terminology, they're still working on that kind of stuff and so on. And, you have to have the translation of the work, the translation of the theorists and so on into Italian for that stuff to be accessible, right? So I think that in terms of, at least on the academic side of things, it is kind of catching up, I would say. Right? Yeah. Pasolini? Yeah. Right. 60s. Yeah. Yeah. I don't know what I can say. How can I speak to Pasolini? I mean, yeah, he was murdered, right? I mean, but like, there was recently a retrospective of his work here at the Cinémathèque Québécoise, right? So I think he's still seen as anathema in Italy. He's still seen as this kind of like eccentric figure and so on. Yeah, I don't know what else.
Yeah, my books are not available in Italian. I'd love them to be available in Italian. My publisher did meet with an Italian agent and really tried to sell the book, and was told by the agent that, like, oh, Italy's still too conservative. It probably won't sell very well. That's just one agent, right? And, but I'm friends with Michel-Marc Bouchard on Facebook, and his Tom at the Farm is playing in Rome right now. So I don't know, and I'm trying to kind of follow all these different like publishers in Italy just to see what they're publishing. And they're, there's this one Instagram account that just publishes new books that are queer books that are out in Italian. And I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful. One of the things that I heard about, and I'm not completely sure, people often talk about like, the people who grew up here. So maybe like the people who, go to school in St. Leonard and stuff like that, they're children of immigrants, and so they've kind of grown up with also like someone told this to me, and I'm not going to say, I don't think I'm going to be very eloquent with this, but just that like they live with this kind of like romanticized notion of like Italy. And so never really kind of let go of a lot of the traditional, whereas people in Italy are kind of like also, they're with the times. So that kind of maybe is a little bit, that goes against what we're kind of talking about here, but I mean, I wouldn't know, but that seems also kind of plausible to me that like, you know, people here are kind of still stuck within a certain amount of like romanticization about being an immigrant, coming over, working really hard, and like family, and you've got to get married, and you've got to like, you know, like what a lot of like, I think VDG was saying some of this too when we had our event last year. But hey, you know, we're also, a lot of us are going to Calabria in a month or so to a conference there, and there's so many queer people who are presenting at this conference. I went through the participant list, so we'll see. Maybe things are changing.
I think it's interesting to think about Calabria and how all of these queer people are going to be presenting in Italy about, you know, ostensibly their queer work and their queer academic pursuits. But I think I really relate to what you've said, Chris, because to me, I see it as like a sort of fossilized culture that, you know, my cousins and siblings and friends, we've all grown up in with our, you know, relatively conservative religious immigrant grandparents. And, you know, I've been fortunate enough to go to Italy many times. I'm part of Il Gruppo dei Giovani Oriundi Veneti, which is something that the region of Veneto does. They sort of collect all of these descendants of immigrants from all over the world, and they bring us to Italy every year for us to discuss at this conference how we maintain our Italian heritage and culture at home. And so when I'm there in Italy, I'm conscious of, you know, the government that's in power at the moment, the fact that Italy is the only country in Western Europe that has still not legalized same-sex marriage, because, you know, there's this insistence within the governing bodies that, well, civil unions are the same thing, so you don't need same-sex marriage, you know, it doesn't matter, what are you complaining about? And so to be in that Italian context, but to also be with all of these young people of Italian heritage who have grown up all over the world, where the perspectives on queerness and transness is very modern. And to remember that, you know, the Italy and the Italianness that I grew up with as a child and as a young adult is not the same as the Italy over here. And so there are differences. In some ways, it's more modern, depending on the town that you're in. I've presented, you know, my queer work at, you know, Université di Padova with all of these, you know, university students in a university town. It would be very, very different than if, you know, I was elsewhere. At the same time, some towns in Italy are so small that there's no room for a gay club. So the gay club and the straight club are the same club, and nobody, you know, bats an eye about that. So it's very contextual. It really depends on who you're with, where you are, and what you're doing there.
Yeah, I don't know. So I know that we've tried to get Mambo produced in Italy many, many times, and we were refused, especially in Rome, because of the Catholicism, blah, blah, blah. The movie has done well. All my movies have done well in Italy. But going back to your point, Chris, I think that with Michel Marcouchard, his plays are done in Italy, all of them. But I think that it's okay for his queer plays to be done in Italy because he's not Italian. So an Italian doing a play about gay Italians, it's still not, I don't know. But I've seen really good movies about, you know, the queer culture in Italy. So I don't know, it's kind of like this weird country where you don't really know where you stand, and it's kind of like you're accepted, but at the same time don't talk about it that much because we don't want to hear about it. It's always, you know, that kind of culture of hiding, and Italians are really good at hiding and at lying, because if we wanted lives, that's what we had to do, you know, especially our generation. I don't know, I grew up like 100% Italian, you know, in the 60s, and it was like really strict parents, and they came from Italy. So you guys, it was your grandparents, me, it was my parents I had to deal with. And so whenever I wanted to do something, I had to lie. And it was me and my cousins, we would lie. We would go out, and I'd go somewhere gay and they would go someplace straight. And then we had to get our stories together. And it was just like, but it served me really well in life. I'm going to tell you something, because if you survive that, you could survive anything in life. So I thank God for that upbringing. And so, but on another, and I really came out when they all died. So there's that too. You know? So it's just like, I don't know if that's a good thing, but I got married after they died, and I got married twice after they died. But the rest of my family, my extended family, my aunts and whatever, it's like, oh, we always knew you were gay. It's just that we don't like to talk about it. And they're just totally accepting of my husband's, well, I'm just one husband now, but you know, when I was married before, and I'm like, to my cousins, I'm like, you guys knew I was gay and you didn't say anything. It's like, well, we didn't want to offend you. I'm like, okay, wait, like you've just offended me by saying you didn't want me to offend me. But it all comes from a good place. So you know what, it's all good.
So your Mambo Italiano is not in Italian?
No.
Okay, we're gonna have to do something about that. Yes.
Hi. Thank you, Licia, for taking a stand and for talking about part of the Italian-Montreal culture. I'm also of Italian descent. I survived my parents as well. They are still alive, thankfully, but they've made me the person that I am today. A few things that I'd like to say. I'm glad that you made the difference. Montreal holds, 325 people that identify themselves as being of Italian heritage and probably more, but do not declare that. And I think it's important that you take a stand for this part of the culture that we have created. There is also an issue of archiving our stories, other stories from the past. For example, women's rights, women's contributions in the Italian community that have worked very, very hard, that there's no recollection, there's no history there's no taking note of what the trajectory was. There's no archive of our stories. And that's my question. The work that you are producing right now, what are your thoughts in terms of how you will properly archive it? You're providing some platforms to disseminate it, yes, but we need to be able to archive it so that others, future scholars or other practitioners will be able to access it. That's my first comment and my question. Second thing is you mentioned Casa d'Italia and you mentioned l'Istituto. Casa d'Italia represents the Italian state. And I'm very glad that they were open to host the event. So in theory, they are representing an Italian vision. So one of you is an Italian citizen, technically.
At least two of us.
There you go.
Three.
The Casa d'Italia, I'm very happy that you'll have a platform there because they are run, from my perspective, by an establishment that partly is open to telling different stories and realities and part isn't. So it's always a huge challenge. It's been an ongoing challenge. My third comment is about maybe Italy and how they would see queer studies and why Italian immigrants that propose their work to the Italy in the boot. Why would we be refused, or maybe they would be reticent? I have a theory, maybe you could comment on that. It's because they often don't tell the story of the Italian immigration. And they often do not talk about that part of their history. And so it's oftentimes negated, and so not given proper value. And the third thing is there is a film, and I don't know if you've seen it, a documentary film called Pagani. Pagani is a small town in the Salernitano, and there's La Madonna delle Galline celebrated every year. So it's a religious, very, very, very important religious procession, in which behind the scenes there is Il Femminello, so transgender, do you know? And they, men are dressed up in the way they like, and they have a blast, and they honor La Madonna delle Galline, which is the Madonna of the, how do you say galline? Chickens, thank you. And she made a whole film. That town happens to be my mother's town. Very, very small town, but it's been all over the world, this film by Elisa Flaminio, and I was very, very proud to see that happen. So I made a long comment, but with a few questions, but I had to make a comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Anita. Many, many questions. So I can begin by saying that there is interest to translate this book into Italian from the Università della Calabria. So in academic institutions, I think mostly if you have a rapport with specific professors, they are open, and also they are open to Italian Canadian studies and Italian Canadian writers in general. Now, all the other questions. The Casa d'Italia, so Chris, maybe you can explain that it's not the Casa d'Italia proper, your agreement. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, so I mean, my this is like the beginning of a relationship, right? So I also want to be very careful and don't say anything, but like to kind of, everyone has been so wonderful in all of my dealings. You know, I met with Josie Varillo at the Italfest Montreal, came with an idea. She loved it. She had things to kind of add to it. We're like, great, let's do this. Let's try this. And, you know, and when we're talking about venue, she asked if we had ideas for venue for this photo exhibit. And I said, how about the Casa d'Italia? I know they did have they do have photo exhibits there. I had been to one the previous summer that showed photography of a bunch of young people, students. And I know that at least one of them was non-binary there. And there's just this like a desire to do more in that space. So and so when Italfest brought it to Casa, they loved the idea as well. So I'm just taking that as like gravy. Like that's all been really great and wonderful. And we've talked about potentially doing stuff in the future. So I think with a lot of these things, it's the same. We often say that, like, you know, you might have an opinion about queer people until you realize you already know one, right? Like, you know, this email that you got from someone who just can't deal with it, they obviously have some queer person in their family, and that person is probably too afraid to kind of actually say it because of, you know, so I think with like a lot of these things, it just has to be, for lack of a better word, normalized. It just has to kind of be shown as like, it's not that big of a deal. And I think, you know, what we're kind of doing with the Casa, what we're doing with Fierté and all this stuff like that is just showing that we're part of the community. This is a space that, like, you know, can be kind of a welcoming home to them. And so I'm very confident for the future. You know, I'm really hoping people come out. That's my big thing too. I mean, like, it's like if we do this and no one comes, then I'm not going to be able to kind of pitch this again. But I'm really hoping we have a really good kind of turnout so that actually it actually shows that not only are there queer people who want to come, but also allies to want to come out, and that it's not just a space for queer people, but it's a space for our friends, our families, people who are
Yes.
Oh yeah, okay. So the vernissage is April the 8th at the Casa. Oh yeah, April. Thank you. August the 8th, 5 to 7 at the Casa d'Italia. It's free. They're gonna have like things to eat, wine. Liana's gonna read. There's gonna be live piano. And the exhibit goes until the 20th of August as well. So, and yeah, and they're gonna be the thing that I'm really excited about is that they're going to be promoting it in those spheres that they would like. For the people who would normally go to an Italfest Montreal event, they're going to see that listing in the program, you know, whereas like seeing it in Pride's program, oh great, like you're already kind of like, you know, you're a card carrying member, right? Like you're going to come out to the events, but there it's going to kind of, and it will push buttons, I'm pretty sure, but you don't get change without kind of that happening.
Yes, another date is August 17th. Is it August 17th?
Yes, August 17th will be a screening of the documentary Creative Spaces.
And discussion.
And a discussion afterwards as well in the ballroom. So, and I'm really excited about that too.
You're all invited. It's also free. You know, they already had trouble with women writers. So I don't know that they're ready for the people in this book, but something to put on the to-do list. Yes, it's very important question to think about. Where would this work be? Yeah. Dominic?
Depends on what you mean by an archive, because it can also be like a university library, right? Because when you have those books in the libraries, the students are going through looking for their topics for their research, et cetera. It's there, right? So then that disseminates into something else and so on. So I think it was the same with, you know, women writers in the 80s and so on. Until we have this stuff published and available in libraries, it's invisible, right? So I think that's part of it as well. It doesn't necessarily have to be Casa d'Italia, right? If you want to be queer about it and subvert, right, that's one way of doing it.
I do want to mention that I'm also co-director of a project at the University of Toronto, the Frank Iacobucci Center for Italian-Canadian Studies. We're doing Italian-Canadian Queer Artist Project. It's an interview-based project. I often feel that my work is more appreciated outside of Montreal, whether it's outside of Montreal in Canada or abroad. So they have pretty much, you know, early on in the project, the film wasn't even out yet, and the book certainly wasn't. They approached me to see if I wanted to collaborate in some way, and they've been really, really open and welcoming, even though I'm not an academic. That's also an issue, right? Because there's a professor there who stands for the project and fights for the project, and I'm the co-director. We just got a SHRC grant for that project to continue the project. And there's the Columbus Center, Villa Charities. That center is supporting volume 2. So I've gotten a lot of support for monetary support, right? Because I need money to do the research and to eventually print the book. Besides Dominic's group, avec, and the Association of Italian Canadian Writers, there's also ELAN, the English Language Arts Network, supporting the book, the University of Calabria. But Montreal, I'm not sure. I'm very happy. I think, so I'm sort of like the person who's about to retire figuratively. They've seen me, heard me many, many times. If they haven't embraced me by now, they're never going to do so, especially not with this project. But I think someone like Chris, who's going to approach the gatekeepers in the community, somebody new, somebody who brings new audiences. Let's not forget, Italfest is looking for new audiences, right? And the audience of Pride is definitely, it's not just that Italfest is gaining something from this collaboration, right? And it should be a two-way street, right? But I'm interested in going in the community, in collaborating with some of the associations and speaking to the grandparents. When I did this book, it was sitting by my, in the boxes that had arrived in boxes by my door. I was also doing a project with seniors, a writing project with seniors in Torino and seniors in Montreal of Italian heritage. And an older woman came to bring me her project, her written project. And she saw the book in the boxes. So we're talking a grandmother. And she saw, and she said, "Can I have a copy?" And she came back later and bought 5 other copies for Christmas for members of her family. It turns out this grandmother has a trans grandchild and has nobody that she can share this with. So we've started like having coffee dates every few months, and she tells me how she's doing and how her grandchild's doing. So, but members of her family don't understand. The community, friends don't understand. And, she is one of those grandmothers who will say, if I have to choose between anybody else and my kid or my grandkid, I choose my kid every time. Unfortunately, within the community, not just the Italian Canadian community, there are parents who are fearful, or grandparents who are fearful. Because of this project, I got a call from the team at Music. If you don't know Music, the McGill University Sexuality and Identity Clinic, they were dealing with somebody who had come out to the family, and the parents were having a really hard time. As a parent of a trans child, I have gone to Music and participated in discussions with parents on how to learn, how to deal with our children, to understand, to get information. What I'm getting, we're doing this sort of raising awareness through literature, through writing. But I think people are afraid of what they don't know. Essentially, that's it. And we need to find ways, and perhaps filming a screen or having a discussion, bringing people out would be good. Having that grandmother tell other grandmothers, this happened to me, or my grandchild is trans. I know that as a 60-year-old woman, my friends of my generation only told me that they had a gay child when I started saying my oldest child is trans. That's because I said it first, then they started to say it.
New Italian immigration, there's been like a rise of, when we think of Montreal, France, a lot of people from France, and it has an impact. There's also numbers data showing that there's also people from Italy, leaving Italy, coming to Montreal, Toronto. Any connection with this new Italian community, or because we think mostly history and just looking at the new trends, is there any connections?
I think that the this immigration is more of an intellectual immigration. It's people that actually want to come here. In my situation, I think in most of our parents' situations, they were kind of forced to find a better life, and they went wherever they had a sponsor. My mother's cousin was living here, that's why she came here. My father's cousin was living here, that's why he came here. So it was a very working class immigration. This is very different, and most of them, from what I could tell, I mean, they're students. They want to. I know a lot of people who want to do film came to Montreal. And I don't know why, but anyways, they should have gone to New York or LA. But whatever, it's more of a it's more of an intellectual immigration, just like the French immigration, right? And so I think that's the difference. I don't know if you guys agree.
From this project, I have discovered, and it's just a theory, I mean, I don't have the data, that a lot of the new immigrants, the intellectuals, are choosing Canada as an open country. They're coming here to live the life that they want to live freely. And I would venture to say that some of them, well, I know for sure that some of them, because there are some in this book, came to Canada because they couldn't live freely as gay men in Italy. Yeah. And it wasn't until this project that I start to think about that. Yeah.
And also there's, with the whole gay thing, I'm sorry, I just want to make one point. There's a big difference between Northern Italy and Southern Italy. Like Northern Italy is very open, and, the members of the LGBTQ community are much more open than they are in Southern Italy. Southern Italy is still very, from what I could tell, they exist, but they don't, they don't, how do you say that in English? They're not out. Thank you. That was relatively easy. They're not out. Anyways, that's just a small observation.
And I think especially with the latest administration, I have, friends who were born and raised in Italy and who split their time between Italy and Canada who are afraid to go home because their impression is that other people will feel autorizzati to spit on them or to treat them poorly because, the administration being what it is with all of its, its fascist undertones, et cetera, is very, very worrying for a lot of people.
So I'm just picking up on Anita's question about archives, and I'm going to proselytize for Bibliothèque et Archives Nationales du Québec because they have a legal deposit law. And I just looked up Here and Now, and it's not there. Just saying, Licia, that it's not there. But so in Quebec is the only province that has a legal deposit law where every publishing house must, at their expense, put 2 copies of every book that they publish. But when books are published outside the province, they are beyond the scope of the law. So people like me come along. I've given them hundreds of, I'm always filling the gaps on the English literary heritage, but I'm also encouraging people. The law has changed recently so that everybody who self-publishes must by obligation put books in there. And there's penalties, and I know one or two people who've been hit by those penalties, rather unfortunately. But it's also a resource because it's in La Collection Nationale, and the books cannot be borrowed. They cannot circulate. If they get 2 copies, one is in conservation on Holt Street up in Rosemont, where BINQ has its administrative offices. The second copy, if they get 2, because sometimes they only have 1, if they get 2, then it is accessible at La Collection Nationale on Barrie. You can go in and consult it. You can look at it. You cannot leave with it. So it's really protecting the literary heritage and the written heritage of Quebec. So Anita's comment, like if you're published by Vehicle and you're published by the big publishing, they know it goes in. But the minute you're self-publishing, you're publishing outside the province, you need to be a little bit more proactive. So get your stuff in there so that people can see it. Steve, I'm sure you're fine. The big houses are picking you up, but people who are doing zines or people who are self-publishing, get on the record, man. I've put friends' books in there who don't even live in Canada anymore, and they're cataloged. You can look them up in the catalog all of a sudden. They're there. So that's my tiny response to your archive question.
If you need help, we put our stuff. Your working paper is either in there or it's going to be in there. So we can talk if you need some help with it or like guidance for the paperwork. Yeah.
Okay, so we've come to the end of the event already. Thank you, gosh, thank you. Honest, thank you so much. That was wonderful. And to be honest, it's the end of the 2-day event, and I thought I was, like a wound up toy, like that was like needs to be rewound, and then your session, and I just felt invigorated, and I just want to say thank you so much. Thanks for the discussions, and also thank you for everyone who made it to the last session on the Friday. It's quite unfair for that to be your position. If we do an event again, you're involved, you're going to go first thing on the first day. But yes, I just want to say thank you again, and thank you for everyone who attended. It was our first event, first researcher member symposium, and we had kind of no idea how it would go. But we had fantastic content and great participants, attendees. Just want to say thank you, and also to our funders, so the Secrétariat, and also Canadian Heritage and CIRLM. And I can't remember what the full name of that acronym stands for. I'm so sorry. I'm so tired. But sorry, Lorraine, if you want to step in for the. Oh, good. Sorry, it's one of those. Please stop recording this. Thank you again for everyone. And yes, I hope to see you at our future events, and hopefully we'll do this event maybe again in 2 years' time. I know everyone's tired. It's Friday. I release you all. Thank you so much. Bye. And also to the QUESCREN team. Thank you.